What's up, guys? So I was out drinking with my friends when I checked Twitter and noticed Intigriti posted a new challenge. So I did the only responsible thing, and after a few drinks I left the bar and got my hands on the new challenge. What we're going to do is open up the challenge, scroll down to the actual interesting part of the challenge, and see that we have some sort of exercise game. We can enter our name and say like we've never played the game. We click on submit and see that our name is reflected. So this already seems pretty interesting. But we don't want to have everything around the challenge to be inside our focus as well. So we right click on the challenge, inspect it, and search for the URI that will be, we copy that, there's some slash and Control V, enter, and now we have the challenge completely isolated. What we're going to do now is we enter our name and click on yes and click submit and see if something has changed. We notice that we have name and first yes in the URL, so that's probably the parameters that we have to use to exploit the site. And we can click on the script tag and see how the script of the website uses these tags. What's really interesting about the script is that we can see that there is no filtering for XSS. So we can see there's no filtering for specific tags or malicious input. What's quite interesting, so in theory we should be able to basically swap the name parameter that's reflected with h1. So we can see it's in header. And right now testing, and what we should see is something like this, the welcome, right? In the same format. Click on OK, hit enter, and hey, nice. So we can see we have reflected XSS potentially here. One way of evading this length problem would be using a super short XSS payload, and one of the shortest ones would be this one with the SVG element. We use the onload event and basically alert one, right? So when I press enter, we get one. That's good. But the problem is when we now enter something like document.domain, we get the error that the length has been exceeded. So we have to figure out some way of using any payload of any length. Doing this would be hosting our JavaScript on our own server and using a super short domain. But when we enter a payload that would actually do something like that, we would get a CSP warning because the website has been built in a way where we can't use external JavaScript code. So it's also quite weird if Intigriti would use something like this as a way to solve the challenge, because it would require an additional server, so additional costs for you. So we have to figure out a different strategy. And the different strategy would be the second parameter, right? We see that there is the first parameter, right? We enter a name here again, and we can basically write anything into that parameter and it wouldn't change the website, right? So we can just measure keyboard crazily and press enter, and we still would get the same output. So we can assume that this second parameter is basically doing little to nothing to our output. But how can we do something like that? As we know, we have this payload that's super short, right? We use alert to get some sort of JavaScript executed, but there's also a way of how we can literally use another JavaScript function to execute as much JavaScript as possible, right? As much JavaScript as you want, actually. And this one would be eval. Not evil, but eval for evaluate. But it could be considered that eval could become evil. Evil! Right? So we use eval 1, and when we enter this and just basically write something behind that, we would get nothing because it's evaluating 1, and 1 is basically nothing in JavaScript, right? But if we write something like 1 plus 1, it actually should return 2, but we don't actually reflect it anywhere in the website, so we won't see it. When we use the console, on the other hand, we can use eval and enter 1, and it should actually return 1, right? If we write eval 1 plus 1, it should return 2. because 1 plus 1 would be 2 in JavaScript, and any form of arithmetics. So what we could do now is basically write eval and something like alert, right? And we alert 1. For example, we would get 1 alerted because it's a valid JavaScript statement. When we try to enter this into our payload on the URL, write alert 1. We again get the length exceeded error. But there's a way to actually get this alert fired up. When we look at the JavaScript, we can see that in this section of the code, the URI is stored in a variable, right? Also the split URI part, so the basically queue part of the URI is also stored in a variable. We can use this to actually create our malicious payload. So when we open the console again with escape, we close this update message and type in eval, or not eval, we just type in URI and see that this is our URI, right? It's not a URL, it's our URI, because it's actually identifying the specific element on the server. So, but what does this give us, right? Let's assume that I have a variable test that has the name alert, not the name, but the value of alert 1, right? And I evaled it. The alert fires up. This is because eval actually checks the value for any type of JavaScript that is executable, right? So it is checking the inserted string if there is some sort of JavaScript, and when it finds it, it executes it. This is basically how we're trying to get our XSS payload fired up here. So if we type in to test it, if it works out, eval URI, we get an on-code syntax error. And we get something like unexpected end of input. And this probably means we have an open bracket, right? We have something like this or that or this that's basically open and doesn't make any sense in form of JavaScript. So how do we actually fix this problem? One way of doing this, and how I actually did it in the first place, was spamming special characters. So I can spam this and that and this and that and this and that and this and that and this and that for basically 1 hour. And I came to the conclusion that I just wasted 1 hour of my life. And it didn't give me anything. So I tried another way of tackling this problem that would be called thinking. So I kind of thought to myself, eval is basically running JavaScript code, right? Eval is running any form of JavaScript code that's entered. And JavaScript is a script language, right? So you can have multiple lines of script and it wouldn't crash the program. That's also the reason why I can use this console, why it's something like a equals 1 and a equals 1 plus 1, right? And write something like this, and it wouldn't work, and still kinda could go on and write multiple lines. It's not compiled, right? It's just a script, it's interpreted. And how this stuff is interpreted is basically by enter, right? We enter new lines, and they're basically separated by enter, like by new lines, right? So I enter 1 plus 1, but press enter, it's a statement, a valid statement, and it doesn't have any influence on a equals 9, right? So it doesn't have an influence. And they're separated by me pressing enter or basically new lines, right? Assuming this, it would make sense that if we actually change the URI, right, by using the first parameter as our payload holder and using enter to actually evade the problem of the uncaught syntax error, right? The unexpected end of input, we can, in theory, run our JavaScript, our malicious JavaScript that would basically just alert document.domain. So let's build that. Okay, after some quick googling, we found out that URL encoded %0a resembles our new line character. So we can just use this, copy it, and use it to build our payload. So what we need in the first row is, we need an enter, right? We need something that calls a new line. And then we just basically need something like an alert. And this carries our document.domain. So, and then we should enter another new line. So anything after the document alert doesn't affect the line. So we can assume that this line will be clean and should be executed by our eval. Okay, so the only thing we have to change now is this alert to URI. So it uses the URI of this part of the JavaScript, and as soon as you press enter, it works. Nice. I didn't expect to get this far with this attempt, so I kind of assumed that I will just get a little bit closer to the int and to the solve, but yeah, it works. Nice. So what we just did is we basically entered this part of the challenge, or we got more on this part of the challenge, right, into the JavaScript interpreter, and what it does is basically nothing, right? It just executes and does nothing. And then we enter this part of the JavaScript because we actually separated with the enter, with the new line. What we did is we entered this part of the URL into the JavaScript interpreter, and it basically doesn't work, right? Because this is not interpretable JavaScript, it doesn't actually resemble anything that should be working. And by using the new line, we basically entered a new line of JavaScript, and is actually executable. So the compiler, or not the compiler, the interpreter does know what it should do, and it basically errors our document domain. So when we press enter again, we get our challenge.integrity.io. Nice. But there is one more thing, or one more problem to be more honest. When we enter this payload in Firefox, it won't work. So the only thing we can do is basically press F12 and see that the console doesn't output anything. So this seems quite strange. And after reading some messages on Discord, I figured out that it might be the SVG element, right? There is some weird bug on Firefox where it doesn't execute onload events from SVG elements. So what we have to use now is some style. To be more precise, the style element, right? So we use the style element, have the same rest of the code here, of the URL basically, and just change the SVG to a style, and we press enter, and see it works. Now our payload works on both browsers, and the challenge is done. We can go to sleep and basically rethink everything I did before I actually used my brain. Bye!